Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we pivot to that period right after the president expired, that solemn but chaotic collection of events that occurred at Parkland Hospital right after silence began in Trauma Room 1. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 56. Pray, pray, pray for him. Those were the words of Cardinal Cushing, the priest who was closest to President Kennedy. Those were the words that the aging cardinal would send out from Boston to each of the parishes that made up the archdiocese. Even though he was a cardinal, he was still a mere mortal. And so he had not yet learned what had already happened. The president was dead. It would soon be known to all. From the very moment that the president's car arrived in Parkland, all of the players that were already involved, including the Secret Service agents and others who had seen what had occurred at that moment in Dealey Plaza, well, they knew that the end had already come, or, if not yet, that it was near. In Boston, Cardinal Cushing would enter his private chapel, accompanied by a chosen few, and beg God to save the president's life. But God already had bigger things in store for John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It was true that Father Oscar Huber was to give the last rites and perhaps be the more recognizable of the priests in this passion play. But there were two priests that day that went to Parkland. And the first priest to receive a communication was Father James N. Thompson. He'd been sitting in the recreation room at Holy Trinity's rectory and heard the UPI bulletins about the president's shooting. It was alarming, to say the least. By 12:45, Secret Service Agent Clint Hill and Secret Service Agent Reddy knew that there was a need to call a priest. And in those chaotic moments that were unfolding, Agent Reddy would determine the closest parish to the hospital and place a call to Father Thompson. Both Father Thompson and Father Huber climbed into the car together, and they took the short ride to the hospital from where they were located. These two parish priests, never had they done something so spectacular as to give Mass for a president or a major dignitary. But now, they were being called as agents of God to play their part that day. They wondered, particularly given the circumstances, if they would need some form of help to navigate what surely would be an intense security circumstance at the hospital. They knew what they had been called for. The president was in critical condition and was perhaps even dying. In the world of Christianity and Catholicism, last rites are a final and very sacred sacrament. In Christianity, the last rites, also known as the commendation of the dying, are the last prayers and ministrations given to an individual of the faith, and they are done, when possible, shortly before death. Last rites cannot be performed on someone who has already died. Extreme unction, or final anointing, is the name given to the anointing of the sick when received during last rites. Hospital emergency rooms are filled with a paradoxical theological question of when life ends when a catastrophic event occurs. And why is that important, you say, in this story? You see, at the moment life ends, this part of a priest's role ends too. That is, when it comes to delivering the last rites, because then, upon death, he is a man handed over to God. He is then in the hands of the Creator, and not a mere mortal here on earth. It is then that a man's soul leaves his body and ascends. But what if a priest arrives to give the extreme unction, the last rites to a dying man, and he's already gone? The dilemma is, of course, a determination of whether or not that is so, whether or not the patient is still living or already dead. Dr. Baxter was cognizant of this. He was head of the emergency room at Parkland, and he knew the scene all too well when death arrived. As the medical attempts came to an end, he said to others in Trauma Room 1 that we had better find Mrs. Kennedy. They would wait to pronounce the president dead until the priests could come in and give the president his last rites. Despite the good efforts of the doctors to formally pronounce him dead after the last rites, well, at that moment, the words of conditional absolution appeared in the vernacular of Father Huber. As he bent down to begin the process, Father Huber spoke those words of conditional absolution into the ear of the president, and the grimace would immediately appear on Jackie's face. Conditional, she thought. The physical trauma was real, invisible. The president's body had been decimated by 2 shots, and one of them fatal. And then it was over. And now it was time for true faith to take over the circumstance. And in this one important moment, the priests could say and do only what the church would allow them to do. It is for God to forever know if the president's soul was yet still there at the moment those words were whispered. Father Huber would soon step away and rejoin Father Thompson, and they would gather themselves up and begin the exit out of Parkland. The president's death, with all of its ramifications, was now a national security concern. In the fog of this event, the military and security apparatus of the government would begin to kick in, starting right there at Parkland. The U.S. Army Signal Corps would commandeer all outgoing lines at the hospital, first as a security measure and also to maintain communication. On their way down the corridor, a member of the Kennedy team would stop Fathers Huber and Thompson, looking them straight in the eye and giving them a clear order of sorts, in the only way that one can speak to a priest in that way. There was an admonishment for both Father Huber and Father Thompson, asking them not to speak to anyone about this. That is, that the president was dead, and to be silent, at least for the moment, on what they had seen inside of Trauma Room 1. The narrative to be included in the announcements of the president's death were now to be carefully controlled for the sake of the nation. Seemingly, the 2 priests understood what was being said to them as they hurried to make their way back to their car. Most assuredly, their exit from the hospital would be met by a throng of reporters, and it was. Hugh City, the tenacious reporter who was Time's White House correspondent, was right there waiting to apply his tenacious style, and he did. He would call the proximate question to the mortal men of God who were now exiting the play. Is the president dead, he would ask? Father Huber would turn and answer the question, only moments after having received instructions from the president's cadre, instructions to avoid the temptation. But he could not, and he would answer Hugh City very plainly and very clearly. Oh yes, he's dead all right. It was, in fact, the first public announcement of the president's death, but it wasn't to make its way instantaneously onto the airways, which the president's team was thankful for. Already by this time, the inevitable and the practical were beginning. Dr. Jenkins, trapped for a moment in Trauma Room 1 as Jackie laid final kisses on the president's body and exchanged rings with the president, had a bird's-eye view as Father Huber administered last rites and prayed with Jackie. With these solemn moments completed, Jenkins would then be left to work on the first order of business after one is declared dead on the stretcher. He would begin to disattach the EKG leads and remove the various tubes and medical equipment that had been inserted in and connected to the president's body in that desperate attempt to save him. A small cloth sheet not large enough to cover him from his toes to his head, was then drawn up to cover the better part of his body. In just moments, the next step would begin. The next bolus of solemn work, the work of cleaning up the blood on the president's body and wrapping the president's body more comprehensively so that it could be placed in a casket and readied for transport to its next location. In just a few minutes, the movement of the body would be the source of an ugly confrontation. In the medico-legal world of patients, a doctor's practice ceases at the point the patient expires. No longer is it the practice of medicine. The reins are turned over to others, those qualified and assigned to handling the corpse, and in the case of an unnatural death, an autopsy by the coroner. It gets even more complicated if there is a murder. Murder is a capital crime, and it falls, even today, under the jurisdiction of the law of each state. As we have explained in previous episodes, in 1963, there was no federal law that made it a crime to shoot and kill the president. Things have changed since then, but at that moment in Dallas, the murder of the president was a crime that was subject to the jurisdiction of the state of Texas. It required an autopsy performed by the medical examiner of Dallas County, Texas. It didn't matter that the victim was the President of the United States of America. By law, that autopsy was to be performed right there in Dallas. Jackie had gone in and out of Trauma Room 1 in those tumultuous 20 minutes. She was, at one moment, by herself, sitting in a chair outside of the trauma room. In the moments after the president's death, Jackie would be joined by the president's personal physician, George Berkeley, who could hardly hold back the sobbing that came with the moment. Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman would confer with Berkeley and Mrs. Kennedy, even though the horror of the event had cast her into a tremendous fog. She was functioning with a discipline that perhaps only Jacqueline Kennedy could have displayed at that moment on that day. One thing she knew, she was not leaving Dallas without her husband's body. She would not leave his side as they made their way back to Washington together. She would whisper this to Kenny O'Donnell. He would, in turn, say to Clint Hill and Andy Berger and Dr. Berkeley, "Let's get a coffin." Berkeley turned to the administrator of Parkland, Jack Price, and said that he wanted the best undertaker in Dallas and the best bronze coffin they could offer up. There were others nearby who heard the conversation, including the president's very loyal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, and Mary Gallagher, who traveled with Jackie Kennedy. They had been sobbing and hadn't yet heard that the president was dead. This was their turn to hear. The need for a coffin said it all. Well, it was decided then. It was now up to Kellerman and others to get the president's body out of Parkland and on its way with Mrs. Kennedy back to Washington. Kenny O'Donnell and others on the inside of the president's team would confer and agree. It was back to Washington. Undoubtedly, Jacqueline Kennedy's wishes were to take priority in the minds of the Secret Service and the Irish Mafia. But it was also mostly because that wish was consistent with the natural security concerns that were immediately engulfing the government at that moment. Was this a conspiracy? Who were they, these killers? Who was behind it, and how far were they willing to go? Was Lyndon Johnson a target too? Were the men responsible trying to take down the entire government of the United States? Was it a focused gesture of the far right that so hated Kennedy and that many of them called Dallas their home? Or was it something much more sinister? Could the Soviets be involved? Was this the beginning of a much more dastardly moment for the American people and the world? These and other thoughts were very real at that moment on November 22nd at Parkland. Thankfully, the violence was over and something bigger never came. But just 2 days later, on Sunday, the accused assassin would then be taken down too. Surely this was not bigger, but it was clearly pointing to something more sinister. The world was on fire for the answer too. What in the hell was really going on? As the president expired, the enormity of the moment was overtaking everyone in Trauma Room 1. As the sacrament of the last rites ended, Kenny O'Donnell came to Jackie's side and tried to persuade Jackie to leave the room, as they were now going to prepare the president for his trip home. But she wouldn't leave. She was staying with John Fitzgerald Kennedy for the rest of the journey. Vice President Johnson, after the arrival of his car at Parkland, had been ushered quickly past Trauma Room 1 down the hall, where he was to wait for about the next 20 minutes with very little information on what exactly was happening with the president and exactly what condition the president was in. Eventually, Kenny Donnell would emerge in the room that the president occupied, and he would look at Johnson and say, "Mr. President, we need to get you back to Washington." It was Kenny O'Donnell's way of saying to Johnson that President Kennedy had expired. He would solemnly add as a punctuation, "He's gone." Johnson then asked about Jackie, and O'Donnell at that very moment would also tell Johnson that Jackie was not going back to Washington without having the president's body with her. Regardless, he advised Johnson that he should get going. Before they left, Lady Bird would approach Jackie, and among all the things that would happen in that intimate moment, Lady Bird asked Jackie if she wanted to change out of the blood-stained dress that she was now in. And it was at this moment that Jacqueline Kennedy would, for the first time, utter the words, "No, I want the world to see what they have done to Jack." It would not be the last time she would be asked that and say that on her way back to Washington. Johnson, still in a whirlwind of thought, knew that there was a possibility of a conspiracy and asked if the announcement of the president's death could be withheld until he himself was on his way back to Love Field. His staff knew that the conspiracy question was real at that moment, and the depth of the attack was not yet known. It was wise to comply, and Johnson would quickly begin his dash back to Air Force One. O'Donnell and others had also advised Johnson that he should return to Washington on Air Force One rather than the plane reserved for the vice president. Malcolm Kilduff, the assistant White House press secretary and the ranking press secretary on the president's trip to Dallas, would wait until Johnson was safely in the car and on the way to the airport, and then enter Parkland Classroom 101-102. The room had been converted into a temporary room to handle all the press that had gathered at Parkland. When Kilduff entered the room, the shouting began as he approached the dais at 1:33 Central Standard Time. Then you could hear the crowd say, "Quiet, quiet." Even so, nervous conversation continued in the crowd. As the room quieted, Kilduff, clearly engulfed in nervousness over the announcement and most assuredly feeling so many other emotions, would stand tall before the group and say, "President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas." What Kilduff said about 2 minutes later in response to a reporter's question would be a de facto testimony for the conspiracy theorists from that moment forward until this modern day. He would use his right index finger and point to the forward area of his right temple, where he thought the gunshot entered the head. He would answer the reporter, "It was a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head." The words are one thing, but what was caught on camera, the visual, was unmistakable, and it was that someone had shot the president in the front portion of the right temple. Or at least, at that very moment, that is what Kilduff thought, and the theatrics of it were unmistakable. Why did he say that? Had he seen the shot? Who told him the shot came from the front or the right? Were the doctors opining on that? None of the controversy was yet present, as it is today. This was literally the beginning of the story and the mystery, but it would not be long before it was front and center in the world's news. The door to Trauma Room 1 was now closed. The more intimate process of getting the president's body ready for this next leg of the trip was well underway. There with the president was Doris Nelson and Margaret Hinecliffe, who were washing the president's body. Dave Sanders, who was an orderly, was also there too, and was cleaning up the room and mopping the floor and gathering up dirty instruments. These humble hospital workers would feel the utter helplessness of the moment. They would try to comfort Jackie Kennedy by offering her a glass of water or a cup of coffee or a place to sit down as she lingered there in the room while they performed their tasks. She politely declined. In a matter of a few more minutes, the president's body would be ready to go. While Agent Reddy would be calling the priest, Clint Hill would be tasked with another grisly matter, finding a casket. At the moment Mrs. Kennedy uttered that she was not leaving without her husband's body going with her, she whispered that into Kenny O'Donnell's ear, and at that moment O'Donnell leaned over and said to Clint Hill, Andy Berger, and Dr. Berkeley, who were all there, "Let's get a coffin." Dr. Berkeley looked at Jack Price, the Parkland administrator, and said, "I want the best undertaker in Dallas and the best bronze coffin." For whatever reason, Price seemed to hesitate, and after a verbal exchange that still left Price asking detailed questions about what they wanted exactly, and aggravated Berkeley had heard enough of Administrator Price's worldly questions and hedging, and he growled back at Price's final question about what type of casket he should ask for, saying directly to him, "I don't give a damn, just get one." Steve Landegren passed by about this time, and Clint Hill grabbed his arm, saying, "We have to get a casket." They would quickly track down and call a nearby funeral home, but they would have to go through an ordeal first to find a telephone line out of the hospital that was functional and could overcome the paralysis that occurred when the circuits began to overload at Southwest Bell. After going to social services and getting the number for the nearest funeral home, they would then run from room to room searching for a telephone that actually had a dial tone, one they could get through on a line. Landegren finally found one. They then called the O'Neill Funeral Home in Oaklawn, run by proprietor Vernon O'Neill. O'Neill also ran an ambulance service in Dallas. Inside the funeral home, the phone rang about 12:46 Central Standard Time, which was only about 16 minutes after the president was shot and just a few minutes after the presidential limousine had arrived at Parkland. Vernon O'Neill answered, and he would hear a voice on the other end with a strained sense of urgency. Agent Hill would quickly explain that they would need the best casket he had at the funeral home, and it would need to be transported to the hospital as soon as possible. O'Neill was an entrepreneur of sorts, if there is such a thing in the undertaking business. He had 7 radio-equipped hearses and a central dispatcher. All the hearses were white, and for that reason they did double duty. O'Neill was of the opinion that death shouldn't be a depressing thing, so the white hearses promoted that. And for the entrepreneur in him, well, they also allowed his business to turn a small red sign-on in the window of those hearses and convert them from a hearse carrying the remains of a loved one to a vehicle carrying a living person to a hospital. His ambulance contract covered the eastern portion of the city, and it was a nice concession to have. He had the contract to transport patients east of the Trinity River. It was a busy funeral home and an even busier ambulance transport business. O'Neill had been listening to the police radios, and he would ask only one question of Clint Hill. "Is this for the president?" Hill answered back, "It's for the President of the United States." O'Neill got to work immediately, pulling his top casket off the showroom floor. Only he had the good luck of having 17 of his 18 employees out to lunch that day at the time of the call. Just he and his dispatcher were left to mind the store, so to speak, as the rest of the crew was off. The casket he chose was of the highest quality, and it weighed more than 2 men themselves could handle, so he waited for a third. and one shortly arrived back from lunch. Together, they would all load the behemoth of a casket into his brand new Cadillac hearse. The casket was solid bronze, and it was top of the line, having its own name, the Britannia, and it was manufactured by the Elgin Casket Company. It was double-walled, and it could be hermetically sealed, and it weighed close to 800 pounds, empty. The Kennedy men would get a feel of how heavy the casket was, as they themselves would soon be hoisting it up onto Air Force One. O'Neill and the Casket Company said it was fit for a king, and the king would soon be inside. Money is no object in the midst of a tragedy, but funeral homes are businesses too. The price of this casket was $3,995, which was a considerable amount of money in those days. As a mini wonder, payment of funeral expenses in 1963 was an irrelevant detail at the moment of the assassination, irrelevant to the entire world. But much later, in 1964, when the cost of the casket had still not been paid for by anyone, Vernon O'Neill would engage in a somewhat embarrassing attempt to get the White House and then finally the Kennedy family to pay for the casket, as that detail was lost in the aftermath of the tragedy. Sadly for Vernon O'Neill, the word got out, and it would become a PR nightmare for him and his funeral business, which reportedly dropped almost 50% when the press got hold of the story that he was trying to collect for the casket. The reverberations of the assassination were felt in all shapes and forms, and even Vernon O'Brien felt the impact.
We'll do it again. John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain. Slow it down. I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president.
Anything about the shooting? The shooter, sniper?
No, we have no information on that.
Was Mrs. Kennedy hit?
Mrs. Kennedy was not hit.
Was Connolly hit?
Governor Connolly was hit.
Was Vice President Johnson hit?
The vice president was not hit.
Has the Vice President taken a role?
No.
Can we see him?
He has left.
Where did he go?
I'm sorry, for reasons of security, I cannot discuss the whereabouts or travel plans of the vice president.
What's Connolly's condition?
I understand that Governor Connolly's condition is satisfactory. He was shot twice, once apparently in the side, and once in the wrist.
Which one? Which wrist?
I'm sorry, Bob, I don't know.
You say it.
The president was shot once.
Where is Mrs.
In the head. Mrs. Kennedy will be returning to Washington.
Was the President
Was
he dead on arrival here?
No, he was not.
Consciousness?
No, he did not.
He did not lose consciousness?
No, he did not regain consciousness.
Where's Mrs. Kennedy going?
Mrs. Kennedy will return to Washington. Yes.
Who's with her now?
Just friends who are on the trip. I get into individuals. No.
When will the
I beg your pardon?
new president be sworn in?
As soon as possible. Where and when that will be, I cannot tell you.
Will we be notified so we can be present?
You will be notified. It may not. It may not be in a place where you can be present. However, the details I'll make available to you.
This is the old section you're talking about, Max?
Where should we repair to? Where should we go?
I would suggest that you stay right here. Any further information, I will either come up and give you myself, or I'll have Mr. Hawks come up and give you.
Max, can we have a doctor? What's his name?
Killed up.
Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
Thank you for listening to episode 56 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 57. In today's episode, we continue coverage of the chaotic collection of events that occurred at Parkland Hospital in the minutes just before and just after the president's death. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 57. Earl Rose was the Dallas County Medical Examiner, and his office was located right in Parkland Memorial Hospital, across the corridor from Trauma Room 1. Rose was in his office that day, and it took only moments for him to get the news that the president was dead. This was his case now. He walked across the corridor to the trauma room occupied by Jacqueline Kennedy and Father Huber. Father Huber had just given the last rites. There, Rose was met by Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman and Kennedy's personal physician, Admiral George Berkeley. The two of them would tell Rose that there was no time for an autopsy because Mrs. Kennedy would not leave Dallas without her husband's body, which was to be delivered promptly to the airport. Rose objected, insisting that Texas law required him to perform a post-mortem examination prior to the removal of the body. Kellerman and the rest of the Kennedy crew had their marching orders. The Kennedy men ignored Rose. They were taking the body with them, and the process to get JFK's body into the bronze casket continued. But Rose wasn't finished. He gathered up Theron Ward, who was a justice of the peace there in Dallas and was there at the hospital. Rose thought that inserting an official of the court would help make his point. But Ward simply was not forceful when it came time to stopping federal officials from seizing the body of the President of the United States. Ultimately, Ward proved to be no help to Rose. As the casket was rolled out on a gurney into the hallway at Parkland, a heated exchange ensued as Rose attempted to block its passage. This 800-pound bronze casket that the president was now lying in was being shoved back and forth as the forces on both sides of the issue began to inject physical force to achieve their objective. There are varying accounts on just what happened during the argument, but tempers were flaring and the language being used by both sides was escalating rapidly. Soon the air was filled with expletive deletives as the verbal exchange was the first volley in the escalation. Rose, who was initially backed by police on the scene, had made his mind up that he was not going to budge. And Rose was reported to have stood in a hospital doorway backed by a policeman in an attempt to prevent the removal of the coffin. Various accounts have Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman pulling his jacket back and revealing his revolver to Rose and the others attempting to block the exit. Still others have Kellerman going as far as pulling his weapon out and brandishing it. According to an account of it in Robert Caro's The Years of Lyndon Johnson, The Passage of Power, the president's aides had literally shoved Rose and the policeman aside to get out of the building. Rose's account of it some years later, in an interview with Journal of the American Medical Association, Rose made it sound less physically confrontational. Rose stated that he stepped aside, feeling that it was unwise to exacerbate the tension. In that 1992 JAMA interview, Rose said that in the corridor confrontation, Kellerman used 3 tactics: his status as a Secret Service agent, an appeal for sympathy for Mrs. Kennedy, and intimidating body language. Whatever the true story is, whether he stepped aside or he was pushed out of the way, whether Kellerman actually pulled his gun or not, the fact is that federal agents finally took control and forced their way out of the building and forever avoided a medical autopsy by Earl Rose, probably breaking Texas law in the process. Dr. Charles Baxter, who was the doctor in charge of the emergency medicine program at Parkland, had already given his approval for the feds to take the president's body. Whether Dr. Baxter had any sort of legal authority at that moment is debatable, but he was one more physician who weighed in on the topic. Years later, Kemp Clark would weigh in similarly, saying that had the disagreement gone on longer, other Parkland doctors would have intervened in favor of the federal agents. These doctors knew that the situation was virtually unprecedented, at least in their lifetime. Some saw Earl Rose's attempt as a grandstand, the sad act of a petty bureaucrat, one who is going to follow every bureaucratic rule, even in the wake of a national tragedy. Others saw Earl Rose in a more objective light, that he was only doing his job, and the true answer was, well, as he said, to remove the body of the president and fly it back to Washington before the chain of custody was maintained and an autopsy performed in the state would be a clear violation of Texas state law. A violation that, by the way, no one was ever charged with. No one would dare touch that one. Speculation here runs rampant. Would Rose have done an adequate job on the autopsy had the body been forbidden to be taken out of Dallas? Well, Rose was no slouch. He was 37 years old in 1963, and he had been on the job in Dallas for about 5 months at the time of the assassination. Let's take a minute to understand a bit about Earl Rose. Rose was born in 1926 in Eagle Butte, South Dakota. In the Second World War, he served on a U.S. Navy submarine in the Pacific Theater. He was one of those men of the greatest generation with impressive life credentials that were brought about by the events of World War II. Rose went on to study medicine for 2 years at the University of South Dakota and then earned his MD from the University of Nebraska in 1953. In the mid-1950s, he interned in Denver, Colorado, worked in a private practice in Lemon, South Dakota, and then he completed specialty training with residencies at Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas, studying surgical pathology, and then another one at DePaul Hospital in St. Louis, where he focused on clinical pathology. Rose then subspecialized with a fellowship in forensic pathology at the Medical College of Virginia. Besides his impressive clinical credentials, what really positioned him for the job in Dallas was that he had worked as a forensic pathologist in Virginia, where he had held the title of Deputy Chief Examiner for the Tidewater region of Virginia. In June 1963, just a few months before the assassination, Rose moved to Dallas, where he became medical examiner for the city and the county of Dallas. According to the New York Times, he was hired by the county to establish a scientifically valid medical examiner's system to replace its existing system of elected lay coroners. Why, that's interesting, isn't it? The concept of elected coroners. Okay, back from that little wander. Rose, while working as a medical examiner in Dallas, studied and received a law degree from Southern Methodist University, or SMU as it's known in the South. Earl Rose was the real deal, but his style didn't go over well with everyone. As I said, some thought he was a grandstander, and some never forgave him for his actions that day in Dallas. In the 5 years following the assassination, he would receive death threats for the position he took that day in the hallway. Finally, the criticism seemed to be too much, and he headed away from Dallas, settling back in Iowa. In later years, Rose would say and write certain things when reflecting on his time as a coroner. And about his fleeting moment of fame during the Kennedy assassination, Rose would say this: "I remain convinced that the laws should not be suspended for the rich and powerful, for in the final analysis, the laws serve to protect them." So true, Dr. Rose. So true. After the president's entourage forced their way out of Parkland with the president's body, it would take only a moment to load it into O'Neill's white Cadillac hearse. Along with a police motorcycle escort, 3 cars began pulling out of Parkland's service road. O'Neill's hearse, a car full of Secret Service agents and JFK's aides, and the last car, which carried O'Neill and 2 of his employees. The funeral director sensed something serious was amiss when he observed his hearse turn left in the direction of the airport rather than right in the direction of his own mortuary. Agents in the second vehicle radioed their counterparts at Love Field, instructing them to permit the first 2 cars only beyond the airport fence near Air Force One. Under no circumstances would O'Neill and his employees or any other vehicle be allowed to enter the area near the presidential jet. They traversed the ride back to Love Field quickly. Sure enough, agents let the first 2 cars pass through a fence close to Air Force One and within view of the aircraft, but halted O'Neill's sedan. The undertaker was furious. The martyred president was inside his casket and his coach, both supposedly bound for his funeral home. The agents ignored his protests, leaving Dallas police officers to assure the beleaguered businessman that the hearse would be returned to him. Inside Parkland, near a ground floor elevator lobby, Parkland Hospital senior engineer Mr. Darrell C. Tomlinson was moving some wheeled stretchers when he bumped a stretcher against the wall and a bullet rolled out. He called for help and was joined by Mr. O.P. Wright, Parkland's personnel director. After examining the bullet together, Mr. Wright passed it along to one of the U.S. Secret Service agents who were now prowling the hospital, Special Agent Richard Johnson. This bullet that was recovered was peculiar from one standpoint. It had survived the journey through both Kennedy's body and then Conley's body quite well. But that was not a well-known fact at that moment of time. After all the apparent damage that was finally to be attributed to it, the bullet itself was virtually unscathed. The shell's near pristine appearance has prompted some to call it the magic bullet. Yes, there was some damage to the bullet, but not the kind that one would intuitively believe would have been present after causing 7 of the 8 wounds in President Kennedy and Governor Conley and shattering the governor's rib and wrist. See a picture of the bullet at our website, www.podcastjfk.com, under the blog for episode 57. Even though finding the bullet in the way it was found, all by its lonesome on a stretcher, was one more scene out of a James Bond movie, even though it was just that, skepticism around the chain of evidence was to become a matter of concern for the Warren Commission. Skepticism that touched upon much of the forensics supporting the case against Oswald. And so, in 1964, the FBI prepared a memo, which eventually became Commission Exhibit Number 2011, and whose principal function was to document the chain of evidence of the magic bullet. Commission Exhibit 2011 would lay it out. First, Agent Johnson would carry the bullet back to Washington, D.C., and handed to James Rowley, the chief of the Secret Service. Rowley would, in turn, give the bullet to FBI agent Elmer Lee Todd, who carried it to agent Robert Frazier in the FBI's crime lab. It would eventually become the famous Warren Commission Exhibit number 399 and one of the linchpins and the main actor in the single bullet theory. You've heard a great deal already in earlier episodes about the magic bullet. It gets even more bizarre when, in 1967, author and researcher Josiah Thompson interviewed O.P. Wright. And in that interview, Wright denied that he had confirmed what the bullet looked like back in 1964. In fact, Wright's position in 1967, at the time of the interview, was that the bullet he saw was pointed. Quite different than the picture of the magic bullet that we have now come to know and love. We'll cover more about this bullet in a later forensics episode. Seth Cantor was a reporter for the Fort Worth Press, which was a Scripps Howard paper. By 1963, Cantor had been in the newspaper business for about 18 years. He was a veteran reporter. His home base was Washington, but he had been assigned the responsibility of covering the president's visit to Dallas, and on that day, he was riding in the press pool car, a few cars behind the president. As the chaos began in Dealey Plaza, the press car also sped to Parkland, and so he was among the first group of reporters to arrive at the hospital. Cantor went on to write stories on November 22nd and on the 23rd, and they were widely used in virtually every paper in the Scripps Howard chain. He would later write several books on the assassination. As they arrived at Parkland and exited from the car, Cantor began to talk to other individuals, including Senator Yarborough, as they waited outside of the emergency room. For a time, Cantor had been standing outside the emergency room entrance, and like reporters did in those days, he liked to scribble notes in a notebook. And some of the notes he scribbled that day would later be important as he testified to the Warren Commission. At that moment, nobody wanted to accept the idea that the president might be dead, but the tension and the anxiety were high in anticipation of the unknown. Cantor was to eventually make his way inside of the hospital, convincing one man in the security detail to let him in the building. And as he emerged inside, shortly he would see the priest in the hallway, and he would look straight at Lady Bird Johnson's face. Before that moment, he had no strong premonition that the president might be dead. But the sight of the priest and the look on Lady Bird Johnson's face was enough to tell the story. When the tragedy began to unfold, Cantor made a decision that the story was going to be so widespread that it made sense for him to call his Washington bureau so that they could then disseminate the breaking story from there and get it into the hands of all of the Scripps newspapers as quickly as possible. So he would then work to try to find a phone and call his office back in Washington. Really, just to tell them what he knew at that point, and even then, at that moment, nothing was very clear. He did not know whether the president was dead or not. Cantor was following the time on his watch very closely because it was a matter of newspaper deadlines, especially for the Texas newspapers. That was part of the reason for calling Washington, because Cantor felt that there may not have been time to call the Texas papers individually. Watching the time and noting it consciously as events were occurring would also be important for other reasons that you'll hear about in just a minute. In the meantime, what would happen next would contribute one more important piece to the conspiracy puzzle that was emerging, the puzzle to this day that we are still working to solve. Cantor was headed down a hallway, and as he passed a stairway, he would walk right past Jack Ruby. In the focus that overtook him right at that moment, he had missed seeing Jack. But he was right there. Cantor had previously lived in Dallas from September 1960 until May 1962, and in that time frame, he had met Jack Ruby. After he joined the paper in Dallas, he became a feature writer for the paper, and in that time frame, Ruby had provided content for as many as half a dozen feature stories and background on characters that Cantor was writing about. As Cantor walked past Ruby, he was stopped momentarily by a tug on the back of his jacket. Cantor turned and saw Jack Ruby standing there. Ruby had his hand extended, and Cantor remembered very well his first thought, which was, well, there is Jack Ruby. Ruby had a knack for, and was known for, showing up at these kinds of moments. Cantor had his mind on many things at that moment, and his first reaction was just to walk away, just to turn and continue on his way. But Ruby did have his hand out, and so Cantor took his hand and shook hands with him. Ruby had called Cantor by name, and Cantor had said hello to him. Jack answered back by saying, "Isn't this a terrible thing?" or words to that effect. Cantor would answer, "Yes." But Cantor also knew it was no time for small talk, and he was most anxious to continue up onto the stairway because he was standing with anticipation, as one does when you're getting ready to ascend up a stairway. Cantor looked at Ruby, and he sensed quite a look of consternation on Ruby's face. He looked emotional, which also seemed fitting enough for Jack Ruby. But then Ruby asked Cantor a curious question. Ruby said, "Should I close my places for the next 3 nights? Do you think?" Cantor answered yes, and that he thought it would be a good idea. By this time, Cantor politely excused himself, and Ruby said he understood. That was it. But it was more than just bumping into an old friend or acquaintance. Now there was evidence that Jack Ruby was at Parkland during the time the president was there. Was it simply the groupie in Ruby that showed up everywhere? Everywhere that there might be an unusual event? Or was there more to it? To this day, there are questions as to how the magic bullet made its way to Parkland. With Ruby now being identified as being on the scene, the conspiracy possibilities seem to multiply. Nobody has ever linked him to the placing of that bullet on or near that stretcher, but the accusations and theories didn't take long to develop after these facts became known. Warren Commission Attorney Bert Griffin took Cantor's testimony, and Griffin asked him if there was any question in his own mind on whether he saw Ruby at Parkland that day. Cantor would respond that if it was a matter of just seeing him, Cantor would have long ago been full of doubt. But Cantor did talk to the man, and Ruby had deliberately stopped Cantor, and they had conversation. Because of all of those things, Cantor would say to Griffin, "I just can't have any doubt about that." In the end, the conclusion was clear. It was Ruby he saw, all right. Jack Ruby was a character. For identification purposes, that was a good thing. As Cantor would say, if you knew Jack Ruby, you'd certainly know him when you saw him. Later, Ruby would be interviewed about his presence at Parkland that day. Ruby denied being at Parkland Hospital at that time. But he was there, and Cantor saw him. And Cantor was more than a credible witness. There is no doubt about that. The Warren Commission would dismiss all of Cantor's testimony taken by Griffin. What would they say in the official written report? They would say that Cantor probably did not see Ruby at Parkland in the few minutes before or after 1:30 p.m., the only time it would have been possible for Cantor to have done so. Well, there you have it. Another twist of the truth. A twist of a truth into a non-truth by the Warren Commission. I'm just saying. There was a second individual at Parkland that day that also claimed to have seen Jack Ruby, and her name was Wilma Mae Tice. She was a 39-year-old housewife, and her husband worked part-time for American Airlines and the Dallas Police Department. She lived close to Parkland, and when she heard the president was brought there, she decided to go and see what was happening. Her children were at school, so she could quickly wander over to the hospital, but she needed to be back at the house no later than 3 o'clock to be there when the kids got home from school. Certainly, this little field trip was sparked by a curiosity and probably concern for the president, as it was for so many. As she stood outside of the hospital at Parkland, apparently she eavesdropped on a nearby conversation that just happened to be conducted by a man that later she would identify as Jack Ruby. Apparently, the conversation was notable enough and she was nosy enough to try and listen in, and when she did, she zeroed in on Ruby. She did not know Ruby before that day. She was later interviewed by Warren Commission attorney Bert Griffin, and throughout the questioning, this woman was concerned that the discussion would get back to her husband, and, in fact, requested that she testify alone and not in the presence of her husband, even though the testimony would be a matter of public record within months. As she tells the story, her husband was dead set against her leaving the house during the day, and he would not have been happy to find out about the trip to Parkland. I assume he finally did. I wonder what happened. In addition, in the months after the assassination and around the time of Ruby's trial, she apparently carried on conversations with members of Ruby's family. These peculiarities in her testimony and questionable actions afterward make her a less credible witness than Cantor was regarding the identification of Ruby at Parkland. And, in the end, Bert Griffin was happy to see her go. I think, anyway, after the testimony was over. For Griffin, she was cover. She may truly have been a witness that was not credible. We don't really know. Certainly there is a question about what stress might have been in the house as a result of her husband having been a policeman for the Dallas police. Could that have contributed to her hesitation? But for Griffin, nevertheless, for Griffin and the commission, they needed a less credible witness inserted into the lineup for this one. They did not need another complicating fact that might point to a broader conspiracy, and especially one that involved Ruby. Because, for the Warren Commission, the conclusion was already sealed. Ruby was not at Parkland that day, even though it's pretty clear that he really was. That was their story, their narrative, and they were sticking to it.
We had stuff going on like people were talking about, it's a conspiracy to overthrow the government, and we don't know what's waiting for us when we get outside. There may be some more gunmen outside, maybe gunmen trying to get inside. Well, they opened the door for us to bring the casket out, and the people from the state or the city, whatever, anyway, they said, "You're not taking this casket out." And the federal people said, "We're leaving with the thing." And there's a lot of cursing going on in this, Everything. Miss Kennedy's standing behind the casket, and the priest is standing by her, and he's blessing it with holy water all this time. And there's a crucifix, metal crucifix, that they have on top of the casket, Normally, these things wouldn't even slide or anything, but they was pulling this casket so violently, that this crucifix was moving around, sliding on the casket, and I was trying to hold it on there to keep it from falling off. So we'd pull it a little way, and they'd pull it back. This went on, seemed like forever, but it lasted probably 5 to 10 minutes. And then someone finally came up and said, let the SOBs go.
Thank you for listening to episode 57 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 58. Today, we tell the story about the events that unfolded in the moments after the president expired, both at Parkland, on the way to Love Field, and then, finally, as the presidential entourage begins to board Air Force One. We borrow much in today's story from the events that were chronicled by award-winning author Robert Caro in his epic series of books about Lyndon Johnson, and particularly The Passage of Power. In these chaotic moments right after the death of the president, our democracy makes a smooth transition of power, despite the tragic circumstances under which it was conducted. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 58. Lyndon Johnson stood there near a cubicle. Down the hallway, just a few feet away, President Kennedy had already passed, and the events had already occurred that would give Johnson the presidency. The news delivered by Kenneth O'Donnell was stunning, but nevertheless, Johnson was president now. Years later, Johnson would recall a very simple fact about that moment. He would say that everything was in chaos. We were all spinning around and around trying to come to grips with what had happened. But the more we would try to understand it, the more confused we got. But somehow, instinctively, he knew what had to be done. No matter what form of grief he was feeling at that moment, he knew that the country needed leadership. He would recall an old Texas saying, "There is but one way to get the cattle out of the swamp, and that is for the man on the horse to take the lead and to assume command and to provide direction." And in the period of confusion after the assassination, I was that man. What a stunning roller coaster of power. Some 3 years earlier, Johnson was one of the most powerful leaders in the U.S. Senate ever. Then, for 3 years as a vice president under Kennedy, he had lost most of that authority and power. But suddenly, once again, power returned, and now he was the most powerful man in the world. Oh, there was fear, all right. As he would describe it, he was catapulted without preparation into the most difficult job any man could hold. His duties would not wait a week or a day or even an hour. He had joked much earlier in Kennedy's presidency that the reason for being vice president is that presidents die in office. That macabre fact had now once again come to fruition. It was a line that later would spawn circumspect thoughts by conspiracy theorists, some of whom would point right at Johnson as the man having the most to gain from Kennedy's death. Motive in their minds for effectuating or helping to effectuate the assassination, or at least knowing about the plot and doing nothing to dissuade the collision of events. Whether any of that was in the realm of possible will be left for a discussion in later episodes, but for now, it was a seed that was yet to be sown. The world was raw with the echo of the shots just taken in Dealey Plaza. The ringing was still in the ears of those who had been there. Up until the president was announced dead, there hadn't been much attention given to the new president. Oh, he was the new president, all right. So far, the narrative in the story surrounded the awful and tragic circumstance that President Kennedy had driven directly into, a storm that started at a spot on the motorcade route that had become nothing less than a shooting gallery. As Johnson's car raced to Parkland, he was almost smothered by Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood. Among the heroic moments of that day was the immediate response of this young agent and his unflinching commitment to the life of Lyndon Johnson. That smothering happened in a nanosecond after the first shots rang out, and it stayed that way until they got to the hospital. Johnson felt the pain of a large man laying on top of him, a virtual human shield, a man who unflinchingly positioned his own body to take a bullet should it be directed at Johnson. Johnson had a reputation as a bit of a physical coward. Over the years, he had suffered from indigestion, and in 1955, his doctor told him that suddenly the indigestion was no longer, and it was actually a heart attack he was experiencing. That event in 1955 was serious enough that the doctors thought there was a reasonable chance he might not make it through. But he did, and the rest is history. As Johnson lay there on the floor of the back seat of the limousine with Youngblood smothering him, Youngblood would tell Johnson that the president must have been shot and that they were headed to a hospital. On the frantic drive over, Youngblood continued to bark instructions at Johnson, telling him that once they got to the hospital, they were going to head straight inside and no one was going to stop them, and that he and Mrs. Johnson needed to stick with him and the other agents in a close formation. Johnson would answer back, "Okay, partner, I understand." Soon, they would be exiting the car surrounded by 4 agents with another agent, George Hickey, behind them holding an AR-15, which is an automatic rifle. They were tightly behind the presidential limousine, and in the moment after the president's car arrived, it had taken some time to coax Mrs. Kennedy out of the car so that they could take the president inside, and that bit of a pause had allowed Johnson's car to catch up. And as the Johnsons rushed to make their way inside the hospital, they passed the president's limousine, and they could see Jacqueline still holding the president. They all dashed into the hospital quickly, with the first order of business being to find a room where they could secure Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. They hustled down the corridor, twisting and turning until they finally found a room that Youngblood and the Secret Service agents thought they could make secure. It turned out to be the minor medicine room at the hospital, and it was a room that had been carved out of a larger room simply by making a partition out of white muslin curtains that hung from ceiling to floor. It was actually a minor medicine room that was in use at that very moment, with a nurse taking care of a patient. She and the patient were quickly escorted out of the area as the agents frantically closed shades over the windows in the room and made the room as secure as it could be. There were cubicles in the room, but fewer places to sit, and agents secured a couple of additional chairs. In a minute, Lady Bird would be seated, but Johnson would remain standing. Lyndon Johnson was doing his best to stay calm and keep his focus. He knew that the first order of business was to ensure that he had extremely loyal men physically around him at that moment. After all, he wasn't sure what was happening. Johnson asked the agents to go find Texas Congressman Homer Thornberry, who was actually riding in the motorcade, and they did just that. And then they would find Jack Brooks as well. Finally, Johnson's aide, Cliff Carter, came in and brought him some coffee, which Johnson drank. Youngblood directed one of the agents to stand out in front of the door and instructed him not to let anyone in unless he knew him or at least recognized the face and knew of him. He directed another agent to call headquarters back in Washington. Lyndon and Lady Bird, along with Youngblood, were immediately concerned about the safety of the vice president's daughters. Both of them were in school. Linda Bird was at the University of Texas, and Lucy, their youngest, was at her high school back in Washington, D.C. And in those days, it was not a custom or a policy to provide protection for the daughters of a vice president. Youngblood would immediately seek to secure their safety by immediately assigning guards to the 2 young ladies. For those 35 or so long minutes between the time they hit the minor medicine room and when they finally got word of what had become of the president, there was much silence. Johnson didn't speak much during that time. He appeared to be calm and collected. He would occasionally look directly at Lady Bird, and Lady Bird would occasionally look back at him. There is no doubt that they were communicating to one another, acknowledging the tragedy with no need of verbal explanation. The events themselves said all of it. They left everyone without words to describe it. These were nothing less than guttural moments. A white carnation was still placed in Johnson's lapel. reminding everyone of the bright and beautiful moments that were just a few minutes past, but now insignificantly placed in the rearview mirror of life. The word conspiracy was in the air, and it was spoken freely by many in the room in the situation at that moment. They shot the president and shot the governor, and who knows, Johnson may have been next. It was for this reason that the Secret Service wanted Johnson to leave as quickly as possible and get out of Dallas. Ray Kellerman had already spoken to them about that. Johnson was not ready to move. He would not leave without hearing directly from the most intimate of the president's staff and getting their direction on that point. Namely, he was looking for direction from Kenny O'Donnell. Eventually, he would get just that. As a selected few made their way in and out of the minor medicine room during those 35 minutes, it was as if each one entered with the possibility that they may have a definitive answer. Is the president going to make it or not? Is he alive or is he dead? Despite the president's unwillingness to leave the hospital, Agent Youngblood continued to advise the Johnsons to do so. Finally, the time in the minor medicine room reached 1:20, and Kenny O'Donnell appeared at the door across the room. It was time for him to deliver the news and to address Lyndon Johnson. There's no way to recreate the look on Kenny O'Donnell's face as he made his way over to the new president. Inside those first few words, he would say, "He's gone." There was more. From here on out, he would address Johnson as Mr. President. For more than one reason, it was a moment that would forever be seared into the memory of both O'Donnell and Johnson. It was as if this was a foot race with runners all lined up, and we had just heard the gunshot signifying the start of it. From that moment on, Johnson was in control. Johnson was known to be different in moments of crisis. He'd been calm and collected, but now he needed to make decisions, and good ones, because the world was watching. More information was coming in, and some that was critical in the thinking that was quickly developing at that moment, particularly around the idea that what was unfolding was potentially a much larger conspiracy. In those few minutes, Johnson learned that 6 members of the cabinet, including the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon, together with Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, were not in Washington, but on a plane that was en route to a conference in Japan. They were, at that moment, somewhere west of Hawaii. Later, Johnson would put it this way. He was disturbed to learn that half the cabinet was 5 time zones away, somewhere over the vast Pacific Ocean, and altogether on the same plane. As these pieces of information were coming together, it was not hard nor unreasonable for everyone to be contemplating at that moment what all of this meant when it was collectively assessed. And that assessment had frightening possibilities. First, on a rare occurrence, you had both the vice president and the president together, and in a location that was outside of Washington. And on top of that, you had half the cabinet overseas. One couldn't avoid speculating about whether this conspicuous absence of a major portion of the executive leadership of the United States government, a leadership team that was now all geographically missing from the capital, well, it was easy at that moment to jump to the conclusion that something more nefarious might be in the works. 60 years later, we tend to think of conspiracy as something that was drummed up by a group of fringe researchers or a few radical thinkers. But the truth is, it was a very real consideration assessed by the highest levels of government right at the moment of the assassination. The legitimacy of the topic in this context is without question. It was becoming clear that the possibility of a conspiracy was real, and that they should take actions to move the new president to a more secure location and do it quickly. Johnson would ask about Mrs. Kennedy and Kenny O'Donnell. Just as O'Donnell was urging the new president to leave Dallas, O'Donnell would tell Johnson that Mrs. Kennedy was not leaving Dallas without her husband's body. Johnson had made up his mind. He was not leaving Dallas without Mrs. Kennedy, and Mrs. Kennedy wasn't leaving without the president's body. So, the decision on timing, at least to the new president, now seemed straightforward, despite the advice that he was being given by the Secret Service and others. He directed Youngblood to get him to the plane, but they would not leave until Mrs. Kennedy was with them. Youngblood got to work right away. He knew that there was risk in getting the new president to the airport, and they would have to leave the hospital using a different plan of egress, traversing different corridors than the ones that were used to enter the hospital, and they would separate Linden and Lady Bird, and so they would need to drive in separate cars. They would shade the windows of the cars so that you couldn't see in, and all of this had to be done quickly, and it was. The cars would soon be waiting in the ambulance bays of the hospital. As Lady Bird would later observe about her husband in those moments, it's not that he wasn't willing to listen, but he was quick to decide. Before he left the hospital, Johnson would be approached by White House Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff, who was now asking for permission to announce the president's death. Johnson would give him a quick no for an answer, saying, "Do not make that announcement yet. Wait until I get out of here and back to the plane before you announce it. We don't know whether there is a worldwide conspiracy and whether they are after me as well. We just don't know." He would also ask to have the cabinet plane carrying the cabinet members turned around so that they could head back to Washington. Little did he know that they were already on their way back, as they had already been informed of the horrific news. The small coterie of Johnson loyalists were gathered up quickly and were to be transported to the plane as well. Johnson told Cliff Carter not to leave the hospital with him, but to go and find Liz Carpenter and Marie Femmer and to bring them to the plane as well. He was scrambling, trying to gather his tribe for the ride back, and it was still small at that moment. He knew Jack Valenti was in the vicinity too. Valenti was a reporter at one point, and a few years back he had written a favorable newspaper article about Johnson. In that moment, Johnson had taken a liking to him. He would also tell Homer Thornberry that he was to accompany the president to the airport, and he told others to ride in the car with Lady Bird. They would walk briskly but avoid running as they left the minor medicine room and headed for the cars. Once in the cars, Johnson would give the order not to use the sirens, with his car taking the lead position and going first, and then with Lady Bird's car following behind. As they rode through Dallas, some of the flags were already at half-mast, and it seemed at this moment that what had happened truly began to sink in for the new president. Seeing those flags at half-mast was an acknowledgement that the rest of the world knew, too. Now, knew what he had already known, but for only moments himself. As Johnson headed back to Love Field, he would ponder the words of Kenny O'Donnell, and most importantly, the fact that Jackie Kennedy was not going back to Washington without her husband's body traveling with her. He also knew that the entire world would be watching his every move in light of what had just happened. There was no way he could leave Dallas and leave Jackie and the president's body behind. These thoughts were front and center. Even as unknown to him at that moment, the fight over the dead president's body raged on back at Parkland. It didn't take long, and the Johnsons were back at Love Field, staring at Air Force One, and immediately Johnson exited the car and practically ran up the staircase to the rear door of the plane, on his way into the presidential quarters. Colonel Jim Swindle was piloting the plane. As they prepared to get underway, the original flight plan was to fly over Arkansas as they left Texas, but apparently there were tornadoes in the airspace. Later, those tornadoes would necessitate alteration of the original flight pattern and require a climb to a higher altitude of some 41,000 feet, higher than the usual 29,000 feet that Air Force One would normally fly at. But they were going nowhere at the moment, not just yet, anyway. That moment, well, nobody knew just what was happening. The Air Force was on higher alert to provide additional security for Air Force One, including fighter jets stationed at various bases that were all on high alert themselves and in a position to be airborne in a moment's notice if any Air Force reconnaissance indicated the presence of any foreign flights or related danger. Various security measures were taking place across the nation and in other spots around the world. The Mexican border was being sealed in order to ensure that if there were conspirators, they would not be able to escape across the border which was closest to the crime. The shock, the hurt, and the sadness, they were already beginning to ripple across the country at lightning speed. A showing of respect all across the country was beginning to emerge. People were expressing their grief together and alone, and with tears and plenty of crying, and sometimes just the silence that comes with stunned disbelief. It was nearing the end of November, and the holiday season was in high gear. Christmas lights were already up in places like Manhattan and New York City, most of them beautifully decorated and illuminated for Christmas, and most of them dark that evening as a show of respect for the fallen president. In terms of profound shock and consequence to the nation, this was the current generation's equivalent to Pearl Harbor. And because of the national security implications, the president's staff was careful not to reveal where President Johnson was, or where he was going, or where he would eventually be when he took the oath of office. The way the plane was laid out was that there was a sitting area toward the rear with 6 first-class light plane seats, and then a small bedroom with beds for the president and his wife. Johnson would tell Youngblood to make sure that the presidential bedroom was reserved for Mrs. Kennedy once she reached the plane. Then the president would pass the stateroom, and it was large enough, about 16 feet square, and it included a small sofa along with a table and 4 chairs. Crew members and some White House staff, including 2 secretaries, were watching the television set as the news began to pour in. The moment was nothing less than surreal. The Secret Service wanted the flight to get underway right away, but Johnson was not having it. So they began to increase the security on the plane, giving instructions for everyone to pull down the shades. It was warm inside the plane. Colonel Swindle had one engine already firing in order to provide some electricity for lights in the cabins. But that wasn't enough to provide any air conditioning. Usually, with the engines off and the plane on the ground, it was a portable air conditioner unit that would be connected to the airplane in order to provide air conditioning within the cabin. But the portable unit had already been removed in readying the plane for takeoff. So, as members of the traveling group began to board the plane and the wait began, Colonel Swindle would need to start the engines in order for the plane to begin generating its own air conditioning. Quickly, as they waited, Johnson would decide to huddle with the 3 Texas congressmen that he had asked to come with him on the plane. There were a number of decisions to be made, including where to take the oath of office, whether the president could take the oath right there in Dallas, or whether he would need to wait until they got back to Washington, where they could perform a more formal ceremony in an appropriate setting that could be administered by the Chief Justice of the United States, and done in the same way that Warren had administered the oath to John F. Kennedy at his inauguration. The fact that a conspiracy was very much a possibility at that moment in the minds of the senior members of the government, well, it contributed to an overriding sense that they should effectuate the swearing in of the new president as soon as possible, to be done in order to ensure continuity of government. The last time a president had died in office was when FDR had passed and Harry Truman became president. In 1945, they had waited almost 2.5 hours after FDR's death before Truman took the oath. They waited until they could get a suitable accumulation of cabinet members to be part of the ceremony. FDR passed peacefully in his sleep while he was in Warm Springs, Georgia, which was one of his favorite spots of repose. Johnson and his team would conclude that this circumstance was different, and it required a greater sense of urgency. Johnson was in a bit of a dilemma. He had told Youngblood to reserve the suite for Mrs. Kennedy, and yet, in light of the situation, he needed to make some very private and confidential telephone calls. He needed privacy. Whatever moment of sensitivity and decency that he had demonstrated in reserving the room for Mrs. Kennedy, he would soon revoke it. He would decide to use the room and to make his calls from there. And Youngblood had already sworn not to leave Johnson's side, so Youngblood would be in the room with him. Moments later, the president would be sprawled all over on the presidential bed. And, at least in one sense, the most outrageous and insensitive call that he made in those moments of decision on the plane was a call made to the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States. Johnson hated Robert Kennedy, and likewise, Robert Kennedy hated Lyndon Johnson. On the one hand, Johnson had a very real and practical reason for calling Kennedy. They needed legal advice and wanted to seek it from the highest authority in the government related to some basic questions associated with the swearing in. Could it be performed in Dallas, or was there a rule that required it to be done in Washington, D.C.? What was the exact wording that had to be used in the swearing in? And finally, who could be authorized to administer the oath of office? It didn't, as a precept, become a call of condolences. In one sense, it was a very cruel reach by Johnson. Johnson would make the call to Robert Kennedy's home in Hickory Hill, Virginia, some 30 minutes after the president's brother had received the news associated with JFK's death. While these were critical questions to get right at that moment, even a modicum of humanity may have diverted them to another place in government where they could have been adequately answered. Certainly having these questions answered by the Attorney General himself, Robert Kennedy, would ensure that they had come from the highest legal authority in the government. But for the answer to these particular questions, was that really necessary? Johnson had a reasonably good relationship with Nicholas Katzenbach, the number 2 man at the Justice Department underneath Robert Kennedy. Katzenbach would soon be in charge of it all, but at that moment he was still number 2. And in later years, he too would acknowledge how wrong and how crass it was for Johnson to have made that call to Bobby Kennedy at that moment. As author Robert Caro points out, Johnson had a more strategic reason for calling Bobby. For Johnson, at that moment, taking the oath of office after the assassination of JFK, an assassination that took place on Johnson's home turf, right there in Texas, would most certainly be viewed, at least by some, as an illegitimate elevation to the presidency. Having the Kennedys engaged in some way, in any material way, with the transition of power would help limit those issues. Johnson knew right from the start that this chain of events would ignite a malicious challenge to his presidency. And Johnson, the ever-strategizing politician, well, he wasn't just thinking about Bobby at that moment in terms of what part the Kennedys would play in the transition. In a few minutes, and just a short time later, he would insist that Jacqueline Kennedy stand next to him as he took the oath of office of the president on Air Force One. In what has become one of the most famous and iconic pictures related to the assassination, Johnson would stand there on Air Force One with his hand raised as the newly minted widow of the prior president looked on, with nothing less than a terribly distressed and traumatized expression. When Bobby Kennedy picked up the phone and suddenly heard Johnson's voice on the other end, he was stunned. Years later, there would be some controversy that would develop around just exactly what was said on that call, what was said by both of them, and what was said in the series of calls that went on in the next and ensuing few minutes. There would be an initial discussion between the two, and Robert Kennedy would hang up and make a call to Nicholas Katzenbach to discuss the situation with him and get needed answers. And then he would call Johnson back. In later years, Johnson would discuss that initial call to Bobby and try to portray it as an attempt to comfort Bobby in his grief, and do so by having him focus on the practical side of what needed to be done. And Johnson would imply that that was all ostensibly done to help Bobby. I guess in Johnson's way of thinking, this was in some sense a way to channel the grief. I have to admit, though, this seems to me a bit of an attempt by Johnson at revisionist history. Maybe it was true, but likely it wasn't. The hatred that these two men already had for one another made the call at that moment, particularly about those business topics, well, it made the call seem to so many who subsequently learned about it appalling and totally inappropriate. It certainly was to Nicholas Katzenbach. Kennedy had stayed silent on the phone in the first call as Johnson rattled off a series of questions in this initial discussion that were about the particulars of taking the oath of office. Bobby was stunned by the call and the cumulative effect of the events that were now mounting. Losing his brother, losing the President of the United States was enough to put anybody down for the count. But it was even more to Bobby. He had just lost the person he was perhaps the closest to in life. And now, just minutes after receiving the news, he was being asked to function with a cool head focused on state business. And he was being asked to do it by a man he despised. Who possibly could have done that right at that moment? Who was Johnson to believe that it was even possible? It was cruel in every sense of the word. Johnson didn't like the silent response to the questions that he was getting from Bobby, and so he continued to press Bobby on the answers. Bobby didn't say it out loud to Johnson, but he was saying it to himself. What's the hurry? Why can't you wait just a few hours until you are back in Washington, D.C. to take the oath of office? Yet Johnson took the silence as a tacit approval to take the oath there in Dallas. Bobby would hang up and call Nick Katzenbach and have a short conversation about the taking of the oath of office, and both of them agreeing that there was no hurry there, and that there was clear evidence that the presidency had already passed to Johnson, that the swearing-in ceremony was largely symbolic, and both Kennedy and Katzenbach agreed on the thinking that it would be better if they waited to bring the president's body back to Washington and had the ceremony there. Bobby would call Johnson back, but the second call was less about whether it was happening in Dallas. Johnson had already decided that it was going to happen there, right there on Air Force One, and now it was more focused on what the exact language should be. Bobby had clarified that hundreds of federal officials, including federal judges, were all authorized to give the oath. That would lead Johnson to quickly call for Judge Sarah Hughes to make her way to the plane. She would be the one administering the oath. The first time a woman would administer the oath to a president of the United States. And she did, using the simple words that Katzenbach had excerpted after going straight to his own copy of the Constitution and reciting over the phone the exact wording contained in Article 2, Section 1. A very simple and elegant oath that was a mere 37 words long. Not only would it be the first time in history that a woman would administer the oath to a man taking the office of the President of the United States, but it would be the first and only time in the history of the United States that a dead president and a living president would be on the same plane while that oath took place. Let us all hope and pray that this particular and peculiar history never again repeats itself. Thank you for listening to episode 58 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 59. Our story today is a long one, and so it will be published in two parts, episode 59 and episode 60, and they really should be listened to together, and actually in conjunction with episode 58 as well. As you know, I sometimes use continuation episodes when I choose to keep published versions to around 30 minutes in length. I'm not always able to do that, but I do try, as I know longer versions are more challenging to listen to in our busy lives. For me, the publishing of episode 59 and then episode 60 is a bit of a milestone. It's hard to believe that I have produced that many episodes, a number that is now equal to my age. And we've also been able to keep a good pace. Publishing 60 episodes is more than one a week since the inception of the podcast. It's probably more astonishing that you all have already listened to so many of them, and many of you have listened to all of them, and some of you have listened to all of them more than once. I hope you continue to enjoy listening to them as much as I enjoy producing them. Lots more to come, and some of the most interesting and mysterious topics are still out there to explore. In our previous episode, episode 58, we began to cover the transition between Parkland and Air Force One. We will conclude that transition by adding two more episodes. Episode 59, which is today's episode, and then episode 60, which is a continuation and conclusion of this transition episode group. In this multifaceted, multi-layered moment in the JFK story, we will continue to rewind the tape a little bit back and forth between Parkland and Air Force One in order for us to more fully tell the story. In episode 58, we made our way to Air Force One and told the story of Johnson's most critical phone conversations, including the ones with Bobby Kennedy. Today, we rewind the tape a little bit and tell you other parts of this important time in the story. I will do the very same thing in episode 60, right up until Colonel Swindle takes off from Love Field. I'll give you a little sneak preview as well. In upcoming episode 61, I will cover the time on the plane as the Kennedy and Johnson teams fly back together to Washington once Air Force One is airborne, and we arrive at Andrews Air Force Base and commence our historical journey back to the autopsy. There's an exciting amount of material ready to go, and I hope you're excited about this next phase. I know it's been coming up a little bit at a time and not a lot at a time, but I do hope that it's always worth the wait. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 59 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Henry Gonzalez was a young Texas congressman riding in the motorcade that day. While at Parkland after the shooting, Gonzalez had declined to make his way to Air Force One after having been asked by Johnson and his team to go with him back to Washington. But the events of the day were still seared into his head. Later, he would recall a moment back at Parkland. He remembered when a nurse emerged from the operating room with 2 paper bags. They were full of clothing, although this time it was not the president's. "Who do I give these to?" she asked. It was difficult to hear her as she was still wearing her surgical mask. She would go on to say that they were the governor's personal effects and that they needed to be signed for. These were Governor Conley's belongings. Cliff Carter was with Gonzalez at the time, and he stepped forward and volunteered to sign for them. And as he was doing so, the nurse asked, indeed demanded to know, "Who are you?" Carter would turn and say, "This is Congressman Gonzalez." There was no need to say anything more, or even introduce himself. As she made her way off to the next task in the busy day of an operating room nurse, Gonzalez would stand there, observing the blood that was still dripping from the bottom of one of the bags. There had been more than one casualty that day in Dallas. In the grace of God, Governor Conley was gravely wounded, but eventually he would make a full recovery. But it was not clear at that moment whether he was even going to survive. The Air Force aide to President Kennedy was General Godfrey McHugh. Being from the Air Force, he was the logical man to coordinate the trip back for all who were going back to Washington. He was incredibly loyal to President Kennedy. McHugh loved him dearly. On 2 separate occasions while they were at Parkland and sorting out what to do next, Secret Service agents asked McHugh to speak to the new president about transportation. He refused, saying merely that Johnson had his own plane. It was the first of many moments where the rift between the Kennedy team and the Johnson team would show through. The shock and dismay and the confusion and chaos that came with the logistics question were magnified in a myriad of ways that day. And what made it worse was an unusual change in the way the Secret Service was overseeing presidential visits from a managerial standpoint. Jerry Benn was in charge of the White House Secret Service detail, but had not traveled to Dallas. The head of the Secret Service not traveling out of town with the president was a new concept in Secret Service management. Unprecedented, really, in contrast to prior presidencies. And instead, Bren had made the decision to leave his second-in-command, his deputy, so to speak, Roy Kellerman, in charge on the trip to Dallas. In the aftermath, that was proven to be a mistake in judgment. Later, it would be investigated and revealed that a good many of the Secret Service men had been out into the wee hours of the night before the assassination and clearly could not have been as sharp as they otherwise would have been on that day in Dallas. Whether it would have made any difference or not, well, that's debatable, and history will never be able to answer that question. As for the agents, in every sense, their decision-making the night before qualified as morally reprehensible behavior for someone guarding the president in such circumstances, and certainly not acceptable professionally. More to come later on that front. As we already know, even the Warren Commission strongly condemned it. And all of this most assuredly led to Rufus Youngblood taking greater charge of the situation than he might have otherwise. Rufus Youngblood was Johnson's man on the Secret Service detail, and he was a headstrong 39-year-old Secret Service agent from Georgia. Regardless of whether they were getting any direction from McHugh, Johnson's men had already decided on the plan to get the new president back to Washington. Before Johnson finally left the building for a moment, Youngblood and others huddled with him to discuss various travel options and how to fly out of the Dallas area. And at one point, Johnson asked whether or not they could leave from the highly fortified location where the Strategic Air Command was located. "Is Carswell possible?" Johnson would ask. Youngblood sent Lem Johns out to talk to a local policeman about the route to Carswell, and in a few minutes, everyone agreed that Carswell was out of the question. Carswell wasn't too far away, but it was too far away for this purpose. As stunned as the new president was, somewhere on the drive between Parkland and Love Field, it seemed as though he began to regain control of himself and begin preparing himself for the events that would shortly occur on the plane. Events that would be the beginning of a period of time where real presidential power would transition quickly, even though the presidency had already officially passed to him. In Air Force lingo, Air Force One was known as Angel, one of the most secure places a president can be, and the presidential planes themselves are also referred to by their numbers. The president's plane, Air Force One, in those days displayed the number 26,000. The vice president's plane, Air Force Two, was numbered 86970. In retrospect, the history of the discussions around Johnson's transportation and departure, discussions that took place early at Parkland after the president's death, conversations between Ken O'Donnell and Johnson and others on the team while they were there at Parkland are, to tell you the truth, unclear. And these conversations were probably confused by the emotions and chaos at the moment. When O'Donnell addressed Johnson's question about making his way back to Washington, O'Donnell knew there were 2 planes at Love Field. And knowing that Mrs. Kennedy was not going back to Washington without her husband's body, and that it might take some time to get the body there, well, the logical answer of how to get Johnson quickly out of the hospital and out of Dallas, it was simple. The answer was to get him to the safety of the plane and in the air flying to some safer place. But to O'Donnell's later recollection, not on Air Force One, but rather on Johnson's own vice presidential plane at Love Field. So, again, the answer was simple, and it was for Johnson to get back to Love Field and get on the plane. Only O'Donnell wasn't talking about Air Force One. He was talking about Air Force Two, the vice president's plane. The surprise that O'Donnell would soon have as he himself arrived at Love Field with the president's body and Mrs. Kennedy was that the new president was already on Air Force One, and key members of both staffs were going back to Washington together, all on one plane. This scene has led to much historical speculation on whether or not Johnson deliberately and intricately maneuvered his way on to Air Force One. Maneuvering that began the moment he came to more fully appreciate the need for wide-ranging support that he would need in the minutes and hours after the assassination, a time when he knew that every move he made in the next few hours would be watched by the world as he fully assumed the presidency. Johnson was coming to the realization that these moves should be made in such a way that he could leverage fully the aura and perceived sanction of the Kennedys. Even at such a sickening moment, Johnson was regaining the acuity of his own faculties and beginning to execute on these critical next steps in a very inscrutable fashion. Before Johnson had headed out of Parkland, General McHugh would call Colonel Swindle from a nurse's station and ask him to move the plane to a more secure location at Love Field as a security precaution and to begin drawing up the flight plan to get everyone back to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. Swindle was an astute pilot, and before he made any moves, he would survey the area around the plane itself, and he then discussed the security of the airport with a few members of the Dallas police force that had begun to put a ring around the field. And, in a smart move, Swindle decided not to act on McHugh's order. He would stay put as he concluded that Air Force One was already in the safest position that the plane could be in, at least while parked at Love Field anyway. He had already been making his own preparations for takeoff, and now, with the flight plans surely changing, getting the fuel tanks filled before the flight back to Washington was a priority. But top-off was necessary because the original plan was to fill up in Austin before the trip back to Washington. It would happen after the Dallas trip had concluded and after delivering President Kennedy there in order to spend a few days at the Johnson Ranch with Lyndon. The flight to Austin was originally scheduled for later that afternoon, but it was a visit to Lyndon's ranch that would never happen. Johnson and Lady Bird had seen flags at half-mast as they traversed Dallas on their way back to Love Field, but those flags probably weren't the first to be lowered that day. At Parkland, Agent Kellerman was keeping in close communication with his boss, Jerry Ben, who was back at the White House. Ben was directing Kellerman and others from there. At the White House, Commander Hallett would reel down the flag at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to half-mast. Hallett had been listening to the communication between Agents Kellerman and Ben, and before most others knew outside of Parkland, Hallett knew what had resulted. It was not long before this lowering of the flag, this show of respect and mourning, was happening all across the country. And it was also not long before a young child would walk to the front of the White House and leave the very first flower, a single one on the ground. Dressed beautifully, she would place it there as she extended her hand past the iron gate and dropped it on the grass of the White House lawn. Despite the melancholy that was beginning to grip the nation, the serious mechanics of transporting the president's body back home and preparing for an autopsy and state funeral were already underway. Lieutenant Sam Byrd at Arlington knew what was next. As the news came in about the president, and it was bleaker and bleaker, he would eventually make an unscheduled trip out to the tomb of the unknown soldier to seek a few moments of solace and silence that he needed under the circumstance. And as he had no more finished saluting to the unknown man who inhabited that tomb, when, in less than a moment's notice, he would be tracked down and briefed by one of his captains, who was now telling him that he needed to take an 8-man Army casket team to Andrews Air Force Base. He was to gather 8 of his finest men and get them on an H-21 chopper that the captain was securing for the trip to Andrews. Back at Air Force One, there was more history to tell. Colonel James Swindle was a 46-year-old carpenter's son from Alabama, and he was the pilot of Air Force One. Swindle was a handsome man doing what private pilots do: wait on the plane in between short trips, getting the crew and the airplane ready for the next leg. And the next leg that day was Austin, which they were set to fly to that afternoon. At exactly 12:30, the very same moment that the president was shot, Swindle was in the communications shack located behind his cockpit, and that's where he had just sat down to eat his lunch, which was a roast beef sandwich that day. Swindle had one ear to the radio, and he was listening on Charlie frequency to the conversations that were going back and forth between Secret Service agents that were narrating the progress of the president's motorcade through Dallas. At that moment, Swindle would usually have been accompanied by his co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Hanson, but not today. Hanson's mother-in-law lived in Dallas, and she was ailing, so Hanson debarked, taking advantage of the short stop at Love Field to pay a quick visit to his ailing mother-in-law. Anticipating that the day's flight was only to Austin, Swindle had ordered up only a partial load of fuel that was delivered to the plane. Being located inside Air Force One is not the same as being in the White House Situation Room. At least it wasn't the same in 1963. And in some ways, the crew of Air Force One and other folks that were there on the plane at that critical hour right after the assassination had less access to the information than the average citizen. Hard to believe in today's modern world, isn't it? It wasn't that long ago, but it was a completely different world then. You see, interestingly enough, the airplane's military or Charlie frequency radio had gone dead sometime after 12:30. But before the radio went dead, Swindle and others on board would hear a puzzling and worrisome set of transmissions, mostly using code names. Transmissions that were not clear enough to know what they really meant. Things like, "Have Dagger cover volunteer." Swindle knew that Dagger was the code name for Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood, and volunteer was the code name for Lyndon Johnson. One thing Swindle and others on board knew was that it was some sort of an emergency. He would speculate, as others would, that it was a riot or something like what Adlai Stevenson had encountered in Dallas not long before. John Trimble was the radio operator on Air Force One, and he was outside of the plane on the tarmac stretching his legs when a member of the White House Communications Agency, one who had heard over a small handheld radio the same communications on the Charlie frequency, waved Trimble down and asked him to come back to the plane immediately. Someone in the motorcade was hurt, and they were going to have to ready the plane for immediate takeoff. At this moment, for the inhabitants of Air Force One, it was unclear really what was happening. Swindle wasn't sure what was happening, so he assumed possibly that the president's back had given out on him and he had to go to the hospital. Swindle figured all of this meant that they were going to have to cut the Texas trip short and turn around and take the president back to Washington, D.C. to Walter Reed or Bethesda Naval Hospital to treat the president's back. With the Charlie frequency radio now not working, it was up to the signalmen to receive messages. But those signalmen who were assigned to Air Force One were not on the plane at that moment. They were, in fact, up eating lunch in the airport terminal restaurant. They were the only ones that could operate the rest of the complex radio equipment on the plane. With the Charlie frequency radio on the fritz and the signalmen eating lunch at the terminal, Swindle made his way into the stateroom of the airplane to figure out what was going on. He asked Trimble, who was back on the job by this time, to radio the White House and try to see if they knew what was going on. There was a television there in the stateroom that Swindle could turn on. Others were doing the same thing and had come in to watch the television there also. He was there with members of the crew and the president's team, including Sergeant Ayres, George Thomas, and 2 secretaries from Pierre Salinger's office, along with Chris Camp and Sue Vogelsinger. Soon, they would watch a vague initial report indicating that President Kennedy had been shot, but no details yet. As it became clear from watching the television what was really happening, it was almost as if none of them could believe it. George Thomas was Kennedy's valet, and he would disappear into Kennedy's bedroom. Thomas had clothes laid out for the president to change into, clothing that he now feared the president would never wear again. A beautiful blue suit, a newly polished pair of shoes, and a carefully pressed shirt. He carefully repacked them. Others in the crew would grasp for momentary personal control in their own ways. The signalmen and other crew that were up in the airport terminal restaurant were having a nice lunch, but would soon become aware of the events unfolding around them. All of a sudden, inside the restaurant, those men began to feel the tsunami of emotion and anxiety that began to overtake the patrons and the staff. Something was amiss. All of a sudden, there were dishes dropping and people whispering and communications being passed from whispering mouth to whispering mouth and from point to point in the restaurant. The buzz became palpable as the news was finally announced over the PA system in the airport on what had happened to the president. The crew members would all hustle out and go back to manning their respective planes. And actually, there were 3 planes parked at Love Field that day, Air Force One and Air Force Two, of course, along with a Pan Am charter plane that was carrying certain members of the press crew that were covering the presidential visit to Texas. Still, for Swindle, there was no definitive instructions. Where was he getting ready to fly to? What had happened? What might still be happening? There were a lot of unknowns still to be answered, in a hurry. Trimble had gotten through to the White House and had now confirmed the terrible news about the president. Trimble would sit there in disbelief as he listened to the confirmation over his headset. Then Swindle got a call from General McHugh. He was still at Parkland, but again, McHugh was not giving a lot more detail at this moment. Just that they were leaving and leaving soon for Andrews Air Force Base. Ready the plane. Swindle would immediately order a top-off of the fuel tanks. By this time, the co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Hanson, had returned from visiting his mother-in-law. He had no more gotten in the door of her house when she delivered the news to him that the president had been shot. He turned straight around and headed back to the plane. They would fire up one engine, enough to provide a modicum of electricity for lights and the TV and the communication equipment, but not enough to run the AC units. and they had already removed the portable AC unit for takeoff. As a test, they would fire up the second engine at least twice and power it down each time. They would get to work on filing the flight plan. They would fly over Texarkana, Texas, Memphis, and Nashville, all the while waiting for more news of this horrific scene that was unfolding. It wasn't long before a pair of police cars could be seen moving at high speed toward the plane. The two cars were separately carrying the new president and his wife and a few close members of his entourage. The president's car was being driven by Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry after a harrowing drive, navigating around abandoned cars in traffic and stopping and starting as they slowed down and then ran numerous red lights, pink lights as they called them. Colonel Swindle, as he began to realize that Johnson had arrived at Love Field and was headed for Air Force One instead of Johnson's vice presidential plane, would scamper over to the door of the plane and move to the edge of the ramp, and then give Lyndon Johnson a big salute as Johnson made his way up the stairs. Johnson had darted from the car, emerging from the middle of the back seat and flanked on either side by Rufus Youngblood and Homer Thornberry, a representative from Texas. On the way out of Parkland, as they began to accelerate out of the parking lot, they had been flagged down by Albert Thomas, another Texas congressman, and he jumped into the front seat. It completed a makeshift human shield inside the car. A ring of people who would have to be penetrated first before any bullet would reach the president. They would all exit the car and follow the president up the ramp and enter Air Force One. Lady Bird and the 3 Secret Service agents that were with her in the second car would follow in a short minute up the ramp and behind those in the car carrying the president. When Lyndon Johnson made his way up the stairs on Air Force One, most of the folks on the plane did not have a full appreciation of what had come to be. Not yet, anyway. Swindle, too, was surprised at that moment that the vice president was dashing to get on Air Force One, but Swindle did not know yet that the president was dead and that Johnson was the new president. The news traveled fast as the new president made his way onto Air Force One. All over the presidential plane, men and women were soon weeping. As Johnson traversed from the rear entrance of the plane and began to make his way toward the forward portion of the plane, for a moment the new president found his way into the stateroom in an attempt to watch the television and understand as much as he could, absorbing what the newsmen were reporting and saying at that very moment. Right around that time, Sergeant Ayres, the steward on the plane, would look out one of the last unshaded windows of Air Force One and would see another car barreling down the length of Love Field, coming toward the plane at high speed and swerving in what clearly was a violation of all sorts of laws and rules in an ordinary circumstance, not to mention this one. And then he would wonder some more as he watched the car swerve and screech its wheels. For a moment, he would wonder how did they get past the Dallas police security in the first place, that whole ring that now surrounded Love Field. The answer was that they were carrying an important group of Johnson stragglers who had missed getting into the cars with the Johnsons when they left Parkland. There were 4 passengers in the vehicle, including one of President Johnson's closest aides, Cliff Carter. Jack Valenti was also in the car. He was a PR man and an unofficial advisor to Johnson. And then there was White House photographer Cecil Stoughton. They were accompanied by Secret Service agent Lem Johns. Within a short period of time, Stoughton would take some of the most iconic photos in American presidential history. Indeed, some of the most recognizable pictures taken in the 20th century. And he would take them as Johnson took the oath of office with Jackie Kennedy by his side. In those photos, Stoughton would be careful to avoid taking pictures of Jackie that showed the blood of the president still there on her clothes. As a White House photographer, Cecil Stoughton had shot many of the iconic images we associate with Kennedy's Camelot. These stragglers were transported in a police squad car, and this group had originally headed for Southwest Aeromotive, which is the private airplane terminal at Love Field. They arrived at Aeromotive and found that neither of the presidential planes were in that location. And at that moment, exasperated and with emotions and adrenaline running high, they didn't think much of throwing caution to the wind. And so they began a trek right across the open runway toward the presidential planes, much to the chagrin of the men inside the airport control tower. But it was too late. They were on their way. And their search wasn't over when they pulled up near the two planes. No one in the car was sure which one of the two Boeing 707s was the right one to get into, and Jack Valenti couldn't even tell them apart. Lem Johns would figure it out. So they made their way up to the ramp and into Air Force One, and now many, but not all, of Johnson's support group for the ride back had arrived and was on the plane. This group, with the runway stunt they had just pulled, was lucky enough to avoid being shot at by the sentry that had just been put in place to protect Air Force One. There were rifles and submachine guns that were most assuredly pointed at that car, but no bullets were fired, thankfully, and they arrived safely in one more godly act for the day. And it really was divine intervention, because at that moment, nobody knew if this was bigger than just shooting the president. Would they, whoever they was, attempt to blow up Air Force One? Run a gas refueling tank into the plane? Storm the tarmac? These were real possibilities running through the minds of the security detail. Thank you for listening to episode 59 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.